The other important thing to worry about beyond predictions and projections when it comes to adaptation is, of course, the decisions that go into how to assign responsibilities and how the non-scientific claims about population that we mentioned before should be carefully evaluated. It's pretty much decided by now that the historical responsibilities will not be playing a big role. So if you go back to, let's say, 1850 as the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, just because of data issues, then US and Europe are the dominant emitters. But if you look at 1990 onwards, where we became much more aware of emissions being a serious climate change issue, then the situation changes a little, with China emerging as one of the dominant emitters. So let's say we stick with that and then take responsibilities from 1990 onwards in terms of global agreements. But we are already in Paris Agreement. Countries have already submitted their nationally determined contributions, and countries like India and China have stepped up and submitted plans that are pretty reasonable in light of their economic development goals and ambitions. Other things still continue, though, in terms of looking at, let's say, percentage of CO2 emissions by world population. So richest 10% is responsible for almost half of the total lifestyle consumption emissions. So lifestyle means the items that are not necessarily just survival types. And then the poorest 50% are responsible for only about 10% of the lifestyle consumptions. And if you look at per capita emissions, US of course is way up here. European Union plays tricks because well, they want to have a union for various economic and other reasons, but they want to be counted separately in global warming issues. Nonetheless, China is up here with 7.5, and then India is down here at 1.7. But even for China and India, the numbers can be misleading because the rich people in India and China are living at a carbon footprint that's much higher than the poor, so the average is not always an indicator. Plus, as the economic development continues, this footprint will keep going up. So that's something that has to be really kept in mind, especially when it comes to population. So it's very easy to go after this super exponential increase in population and immediately extrapolate it to climate change. But actually it's not that simple, basically because of this per capita emission. So the most of the emissions have come from a minority of the people who have consumed a lot, and this will continue to be the case in the sense even if the fertility rates are dropping. So this is looking at cumulative share of the world population by various countries for different decade periods: 1950 to 55, 75 to 80, 2005 to 10, and so on. Fertility rates are dropping, number of children per woman are dropping, population still grows, of course. Projections have to be considered in that light, that educating women leads to tremendous drop in fertility rates and then eventually population. But each woman that has one or two kids gives more resources to each kid to have a good life, which means higher consumption. So it's not the population increase that's creating necessarily the climate change issues. It does affect other things like habitats, conflicts with wildlife, land use, deforestation, pressure on demand, pressure on water resources and food demand, and so on, fisheries, etc. But one has to be still very careful in making claims about population and climate change, because unless consumption begins to drop with decreased fertility rates, population is not going to solve the climate change problem. The other thing to worry about is the way in which countries have reached the so-called high human dimensions index. Basically includes education, per capita income, women's health, children's education, etc. The indices that account for standards of living. And I don't know if you can see it, but this is talking about Human Development Index, and this is the ecological footprints in gigahectares. And this is various continents mentioned here. And as you can imagine, very high human development has come with very high ecological footprint. Some countries like Finland and Australia, which are small, Switzerland, Denmark, Netherlands, especially Norway is down here. Rich countries have gotten richer and better standard of living by exploiting the environment and having a huge environmental footprint, and the sustainable development quadrant is down here, and essentially nobody is down here, and all the poor countries are here with low human development index but also low and ecological footprint. So if you want to move all of these up here in terms of HDI, which is necessary, otherwise you're going to create other problems, social unrest, etc. How do you do it? Do you have to go up in ecological footprint, or are we going to find a way to go flat across increasing human development index without increasing environmental footprint? So those are also issues beyond the predictions and projections. Let me add a little bit more. Sorry about switching in and out of projection mode. Just see how long the podcast is, because I don't want to make them too long. Attention span is around 7 to 10 minutes. Of course, some of them are as long as 15 minutes. How does human mind work? So issues like environment, shared resources like a river, a mountain, a forest, a park, a common pasture, whatever, always raise issues that are called intrinsic values and extrinsic values, whether you care about power, image, etc., or do you care about environment, friendships, relations, etc. There is a construct called the elephant and the rider in the way human mind works. People like Jonathan Haidt have used it to argue that we have certain intrinsic tendencies, liberal, conservative, whatever. But the idea is that the brain is made up of the rational part and an emotional part, relates to the neocortex and the amygdala as shown here. So the rider is a metaphor for the rational mind. You think that's good, we can rationalize, but actually it turns out that when it comes to making decisions, the rational mind tends to rationalize too long and hesitate and not make decisions and just vacillates. Elephant, which is metaphorically much larger than the rider, hard to steer, but once it gets going, hard to stop, is a metaphor for the emotional mind, a so-called amygdala, which converts physical experiences into emotional responses. So once the path is clear and the goals are clear, the elephant can get going, and the rider will be just driven along. But the best decisions happen when the rider and the elephant agree, and then they decide this is something to do. So there are various ideas on how to bring about these kind of changes in books like The Switch by Dan and Chip Heath, which use these, and several examples of how big changes were made to say how to steer the elephant, clear the path, define the goal, and how to motivate the rider, and so on. So that's a big part. We cannot ignore the fact that US is not accepting climate change as easily as other countries because of its history of social experiences with resource adversity and limitations and so on, especially compared to Europe or the rest of the world. Why is it that Europe and the rest of the world do not have issues with climate change, but US continues to struggle? culturally it's related to other things that are going on right now, but let's not go in there because again I'll be going out of my expertise. So this is the human mind part, where when you face choice and it's not clear, the rider and the elephant can struggle. But if the path is clear, goal is set, and there is an emotional identity with it, then the rider and the elephant can move and make big decisions. So this is an example I just randomly picked from the internet. Elephant is moving along and the people behind are being patient, but there's one driver that's going to come from this side, and instead of waiting is going to try to pass the elephant. So fooling the elephant is never going to work, politically, scientifically, or whatever, because if you lose credibility, that's going to be an issue. So this guy is trying to pass, and then the elephant is not happy, so he's going to just push him over into the fence. So we should be careful as climate scientists in terms of means and ends. If we keep saying putting out alarmist messages with the goal being to get climate action out of people, the approach is that means justify the end, or end justifies the means, then we have to be careful about what negative impacts that could have. And adaptation is again a problem in terms of rich and poor. So global warming is already creating winners and losers. Warming would make Siberia a rich agricultural field, for example, and tropical countries would suffer. So there are adaptation limitations, and adaptation is expected to reduce vulnerability, whereas mitigation is going to reduce the hazard itself. And risk, we think in terms of hazard times vulnerability times exposure. So it's going to depend on your vulnerability, what hazard changes will happen because of climate change, and how exposed you are going to be. So let's say this elephant is happily crossing over this little bump here, but this guy is not able to do the same, so he has to adapt. So it's just a silly video somewhere from the WhatsApp message that was forwarded. I don't know who owns it, so apologies. So you can see that this guy decided I cannot make this transition, so he's going to find a way to do it. There is the adaptation. Look at how amazing it is. He's going to lie down and just roll over. There is the adaptation. Okay, so that is what the analogy is for the rider and the elephant. We have a few more points I'll make in the next podcast. Just included those for metaphorically explaining adaptation, limitations, and gaps.